The air in the Atherton ballroom was thick with the scent of wilting roses and expensive perfume, a cloying sweetness that mirrored the gilded cage of Elara Vance's life. Every crystal teardrop hanging from the chandeliers seemed to weep light onto the swirling silks and satins below, each a pinpoint of judgment in the vast, glittering expanse of the London season. For Elara, the light felt less like a caress and more like an interrogation. She stood beside her mother, a faint, practiced smile fixed upon her lips, a sculpture of polite compliance. Her future, once a distant, hazy landscape, had solidified into a single, unyielding path. Marriage to Viscount Alistair Finch. It was, by all accounts, a brilliant match. The Viscount was handsome, charming, and heir to a respectable, if not staggering, fortune. For the Vances, whose noble lineage was far richer than their coffers, the union was not merely advantageous, it was a lifeline. Elara had felt the weight of her family's quiet desperation for years, in the careful mending of her gowns, in the strained cheerfulness of her father's dinner conversation, in the way her mother's eyes would scan a room, calculating and anxious. Alistair's proposal had been the answer to 1,000 unspoken prayers. Elara smoothed a gloved hand over the deep emerald silk of her gown, the fabric a cool whisper against her skin. She had liked Alistair, truly. His laughter was easy. His compliments flowed like cheap champagne, effervescent and plentiful, if lacking in substance. She had allowed herself to believe that this was enough, that affection could be cultivated, that respect could grow in the soil of shared duty. She had constructed a fragile hope for a future of quiet companionship, a life less about passion and more about peaceful coexistence. It was a sensible dream, a practical one, befitting a woman whose primary duty was to secure her family's stability. "You look lovely tonight, my dear," her mother murmured, her fan fluttering with a nervous energy that betrayed her serene expression. "The Viscount will be utterly captivated." Elara's smile tightened a fraction. "Thank you, Mamma." She did not say that the Viscount's captivation felt less like a prize and more like a prerequisite, a box to be ticked on the log, the forgivable carelessness of a man for whom life had always been easy. Tonight, however, the feeling was different. It was sharper, colder. Her eyes found her cousin, Isabel, across the room. Isabel was a vision in pale rose, her blonde hair piled high, in an elaborate confection of curls and pearls. She was laughing, her head thrown back, a gesture of practiced abandon. Isabel, who had grown up in Elara's shadow, always a step behind, always watching with an envy that was poorly disguised as admiration. The two of them were engaged in a whispered, animated conversation with a group of young dandies. There was a feverish quality to Isabel's gaiety tonight, a brittle edge to her smile that set Elara's teeth on edge. "He is probably with his friends, Elara," her mother said, following her gaze and misinterpreting its target. "Men in their tiresome politics. He will be here." Elara nodded, forcing the knot in her stomach to unclench. Her mother was right. She was being fanciful, allowing the oppressive heat of the ballroom to muddle her thoughts. Alistair would appear. He would offer a charmingly flimsy excuse, and she would accept it with a graceful nod, because that was her role. That was the bargain. The orchestra struck the opening chords of the waltz, a soaring, romantic melody that felt like a mockery. The dance floor filled with couples, a kaleidoscope of color and movement. Elara stood frozen, a statue of emerald silk at the edge of the swirling tide. The whispers started then, subtle as the rustle of a fan, but just as potent. Glances were cast in her direction, first curious, then pitying. The Viscount's intended, abandoned before the first dance. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that crept up her neck and burned her cheeks. She could feel her mother stiffen beside her, her grip on her fan turning white-knuckled. "Perhaps he was taken ill," her mother whispered, the words a desperate prayer. But Elara knew it wasn't illness. A different, more dreadful certainty was beginning to dawn. She scanned the room again, her gaze now sharp and frantic, moving past the dancers, past the dowagers on their velvet chairs, towards the shadowed alcoves and curtained doorways that lined the grand hall. And then she saw it, a flash of pale rose silk, disappearing through a set of French doors that led to the conservatory. It was a distant heartbeat. Moonlight filtered through the glass panes of the ceiling, silvering the leaves of potted palms, and casting long, distorted shadows on the stone floor. It was a place of staged, artificial nature, a fitting backdrop for what she was about to find. Barrett, she heard them before she saw them, a low murmur of voices, a soft, feminine laugh that was achingly familiar. Ilara followed the sound, her slippers silent on the flagstones. She rounded a large, funereal-looking urn, overflowing with ivy, and stopped. There, in a secluded alcove, framed by the drooping fronds of a massive fern, were Alistair and Isabel. His back was to her, but she knew the confident set of his shoulders, the dark curl of his hair. He had Isabel pressed against the cool glass of the conservatory wall, his hands tangled in her perfectly arranged curls, now coming undone. Isabel's arms were wrapped around his neck, her pale rose gown a stark contrast to the dark green of the foliage behind her. "Must be careful," Alistair was murmuring, his voice thick and low. "Just a few more weeks, and then we can be free of this tedious arrangement." Isabel laughed again, a sound stripped of its earlier brittle quality, now low and triumphant. "Poor Ilara. She's so dreadfully dutiful. She'll probably thank you for the honor of being cast aside." Her fingers traced the line of his jaw. "You will tell her tomorrow." "I will," Alistair promised. He lowered his head, and his mouth found hers in a kiss that was anything but dutiful. It was hungry, consuming, a flagrant betrayal illuminated in a sliver of cold moonlight. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The air, thick with the scent of jasmine and damp earth, became unbreathable. Ilara felt a strange, chilling detachment, as if she were watching a scene in a particularly cruel play. This was not her life. This could not be her fiancé, the man whose ring she wore, the man upon whom her family's entire future rested. This could not be her cousin, the girl who had borrowed her ribbons and whispered secrets with her in the dark. But it was. The emerald on her finger felt like ice. The carefully constructed hope for her future looks like. The sheer absurdity of the words, the classic, cowardly lie, broke the spell of Ilara's paralysis. A cold, quiet fury rose within her, so potent it eclipsed the humiliation. She looked from his flushed, guilty face to Isabel's smug one. She saw the truth of them, their shared weakness, their casual, selfish cruelty. She said nothing. There were no words for this. No accusation could capture the magnitude of the betrayal. No tear could convey the depth of the wound. To speak would be to engage with them on their level, to grant their sordid little affair the dignity of a scene. She would not give them that satisfaction. With a stillness that felt more powerful than any scream, Ilara turned her back on them. She walked out of the conservatory, her spine ramrod straight, leaving the scent of jasmine and deceit behind her. She re-entered the ballroom, a ghost in emerald silk. The music was still playing, the dancers were still swirling, but the entire world had changed. Every eye seemed to be on her now, not with pity, but with a rapacious, hungry curiosity. The whispers had grown louder, more certain. The story had already begun to write itself. She walked directly towards the ballroom's grand entrance, her only thought a desperate need for air, for escape. But her path was blocked. A figure stood before her, tall and immovable, a column of black against the glittering chaos. He was a man she knew only by reputation, a figure who moved through society like a shadow, observing but never participating. Duke Alaric Beaumont of Blackwood. He was impossibly tall, dressed in immaculate, severe black. The starkness of his attire a rebuke to the frivolous colors of the room. His face was all sharp angles and forbidding planes, as if carved from granite. His hair was black as a raven's wing, and his eyes, a startling pale gray, were fixed on her. They held no pity, no curiosity, only a strange, unnerving intensity. The Duke of Blackwood was a man of immense power and older, darker wealth than anyone else in the room. He was also a recluse. a widower, a man whispered to be broken by a past tragedy. She met his gaze, refusing to be cowed. "Your Grace." The entire room held its breath. From the corner of her eye, she saw Alistair and Isabel emerge from the conservatory, their faces pale with alarm as they took in the scene. The Duke of Blackwood took a single step closer. The air around him seemed to drop in temperature. His pale grey eyes held hers, and for a fleeting moment, Ilara thought she saw not coldness, but a flicker of something else, something akin to understanding, a shared knowledge of loss. Then he did the most unexpected, the most impossible thing. In the echoing silence of the Atherton ballroom, with the whole of the London season as his witness, the cold, remote and broken Duke of Blackwood made a declaration that would irrevocably alter the course of her life. "My condolences on the end of your engagement," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that sent a shiver through her. He did not even glance at the disgraced Viscount, now hovering by the door. "It seems you are in need of a new one. Forgive my lack of ceremony, but the circumstances appear to warrant a certain directness. Will you marry me?" A collective gasp swept through the room, a sound like the rushing of a great wind. Ilara stared at him, utterly dumbfounded. Her mind, reeling from one shock, could not possibly process another. It was a dream, a feverish hallucination brought on by humiliation and heartbreak. This man, this formidable, unapproachable duke, was proposing marriage to her. Here, now, in the wreckage of her social ruin. She looked past him, to Alistair's face, now a mask of pure, disbelieving horror. She saw Isabel's triumphant smirk curdle into a rictus of outrage. She looked at her mother, whose expression was a frantic, unreadable mix of terror and wild, desperate hope. And then she looked back at the Duke. His expression had not changed. He was not offering romance, or affection, or even comfort. His eyes were clear, his posture unyielding. This was not a rescue. It was a transaction, a proposition. He was offering her one cage in exchange for another. A grander cage, to be sure, but a cage nonetheless. Her world had been shattered. Her reputation was in tatters. Her family's future, which had rested so heavily on her shoulders, was now in ruins. She clear and steady, ringing through the profound silence of the ballroom. "Yes, Your Grace, I will." The Duke gave a single sharp nod, as if concluding a business deal. He offered her his arm. It was a formal, impersonal gesture, but as Ilara placed her trembling, gloved fingers on the black wool of his sleeve, she felt not a cage closing around her, but the first terrifying step onto solid ground in a world that had turned to quicksand. The fabric was cool and unyielding, much like the man himself. As he led her from the ballroom, leaving a maelstrom of shock and speculation in their wake, Ilara knew she had just traded one kind of ruin for another. She did not know which would be worse, but for the first time that night, she felt a sliver of agency. She had made a choice. The consequences, whatever they might be, would be her own. The journey to Blackwood Manor was conducted in a silence as heavy and oppressive as the brocade curtains of the Duke's carriage. They had left London under a cloak of pre-dawn fog, escaping the city before the scandal of the previous night could fully erupt in the morning papers. Ilara sat opposite the Duke, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her hastily packed trunk strapped to the back of the coach. She had not returned to her family's home. A curt note, delivered by one of the Duke's footmen, had informed her parents of the new arrangement. Another, equally terse, had been dispatched to the solicitors to begin the process of drawing up the marriage contracts. It had all been handled with a chilling, bloodless efficiency that was, Ilara was beginning to understand, the Duke's defining characteristic. He had not spoken more than a handful of words to her since his shocking proposal. He had escorted her from the ballroom, placed her in his waiting carriage, and now sat watching the grey, rolling landscape, as if she were nothing more than a piece of luggage he was transporting. He had saved her from public annihilation, but his presence offered no comfort. If anything, it was more unnerving than the open scorn of the ton. Ilara studied him from beneath her lashes. In the flat, grey light of morning, he looked even more formidable than he had in the ballroom. The sharp lines of his face seemed etched by a sorrow so profound it had become a permanent part of his structure. His pale eyes were fixed on the mist-shrouded fields. "Family will be provided for," Their debts will be settled. You will want for nothing in a material sense. The words were a confirmation of what she already knew. This was a purchase. He had bought a wife to quiet the gossip that would inevitably follow a man of his station, and in doing so, had acquired her family's debt. It was a clean, simple transaction. "Thank you, Your Grace," she managed, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. He finally turned his gaze to her, and the full, unnerving force of his attention made her feel like a moth pinned to a board. "Let us be clear, Lady Alara. I am not offering you affection. I am not offering you companionship. The tragedy that befell my family is a matter of public record. I do not have a heart to give. It is buried with my late wife." The bluntness of his declaration was like a slap. Alara had known of the Duchess's death, of course. It had happened some 2 years prior, a fall from a horse, the papers had said, a terrible accident. But she had not known the depths of the wound it had left. "I require a duchess," he went on, his voice a low, cold monotone. "I require a respectable chatelaine for my house and a mother for my daughter. In return, you will have the protection of my name and my fortune. You will have a life of comfort and security, but you will not have a husband in any emotional sense. We will maintain separate rooms and separate lives beneath one roof. Is that understood?" It was the coldest, most brutal set of terms she could have imagined. He was drawing the lines of her new prison with stark, unforgiving clarity. She was to be a figurehead, a decorative and functional piece of the Blackwood estate, but nothing more. The fragile hope she had once held for a life of quiet companionship with Alistair seemed like a wildly passionate dream compared to this desolate reality. But what choice did she have? To refuse now would be to cast herself back into the abyss. She thought of her parents, of the relief that must have warred with their confusion upon receiving the Duke's note. She thought of Alistair and Isabel, and a spike of cold fury gave her strength. She would not be broken. She would endure this. "Perfectly, Your Grace." Blackwood Manor appeared suddenly, a dark, Gothic silhouette against the brooding sky. It was not a house. It was a fortress, a vast, sprawling edifice of granite and slate that seemed to have grown from the unforgiving land itself. It stood on a rise, dominating the surrounding countryside, its many mullioned windows like vacant eyes staring out at the desolate moors. There were no soft edges, no welcoming gardens, only stone and sky and the cry of the wind. It was the most intimidating place Alara had ever seen, a perfect reflection of its master. Sell. As the carriage rumbled up the long, winding drive, a sense of profound isolation washed over her. This was to be her home, this cold, lonely monument to a forgotten grief. Second, the carriage drew to a halt before a massive oak door studded with iron. A footman hurried to open the door, and the Duke descended without a word, turning to offer Alara a perfunctory hand. His touch was cold, even through her glove. Second, the great hall was cavernous and dim, the air within it still and frigid. A fire struggled for life in a hearth large enough to roast an ox, but its meager flames did little to dispel the gloom or the chill. Dark, polished wood, somber tapestries depicting grim hunting scenes, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls. The silence was absolute, broken only by the echo of their footsteps on the black and white marble floor. Second, a woman in a severe black dress, her grey hair pulled into a tight bun, emerged from the shadows. She curtsied deeply. "Your Grace, welcome home." "Mrs. Gable," the Duke acknowledged with a nod. "This is Lady Alara Vance, my future wife. See that her things are taken to the garden suite in the east wing, and prepare the north chamber for me." Separate wings. He was wasting no time in establishing the distance between them. Second, Mrs. Gable's eyes, shrewd and observant, flickered towards Alara for a moment. There was no warmth in her expression, but no hostility either. It was a look of neutral, professional assessment. "Very good, Your Grace. Welcome to Blackwood, my lady." "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Alara said, her voice seeming small in the vast, echoing space. "My daughter, Rosalie," the Duke said. His voice passed down a long gallery, its windows looking out onto a landscape of grey sky and wind-swept trees. "The garden suite," Mrs. Gable announced, pushing open a heavy wooden door. The rooms were vast. A sitting room, a bedroom, a dressing room, all furnished with heavy, dark, exquisitely carved furniture. The fabrics were velvets and brocades in deep jewel tones, but they had a faded, unloved quality to them. Everything was immaculately clean, yet the rooms felt dusty with disuse, as if no one had truly lived in them for a very long time. Tall, arched windows looked out over what had once, perhaps, been a magnificent garden. Now it was a tangled, tragic wreck. Weeds choked the flower beds. Thorny brambles strangled the rose bushes, and a stone fountain in the center was green with moss and neglect. It was a perfect mirror of the house itself, a place where life had once flourished, now left to decay. "It has a lovely view of the west lawn," Mrs. Gable said, the statement so at odds with the desolate scene outside that it bordered on the absurd. "It has potential," Ilara replied, her gaze fixed on the ruined garden. Mrs. Gable's lips thinned into what might have been a smile. "An optimistic way of putting it, my lady. The last Duchess, she loved that garden." The housekeeper's voice was carefully neutral, but Ilara heard the ghost of an emotion in it. "His Grace has not allowed the gardeners to touch it since her passing. A memorial to grief, then. A living, dying monument to his dead wife." Ilara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She was an intruder here, a usurper in a house still held captive by a ghost. "Will there be anything else, my lady?" "No, thank you, Mrs. Gable. I think I would like to be alone for a while." The housekeeper nodded and withdrew, closing the door with a soft click that sounded like a lock turning. Ilara walked to the window and pressed her hand against the cold glass. She looked out at the tangled, dying garden, and beyond it, to the bleak, endless moors under a sky the color of slate. The scale of her isolation was... Duke wore the same unrelenting black he always did. When he slid the heavy gold band onto her finger, his touch was as cold and impersonal as the stone altar. He spoke his vows in a low, clear monotone, the words of love and cherishing rendered utterly meaningless by his delivery. Ilara spoke hers in a quiet, steady voice, feeling like an actress in a play she had not rehearsed. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, there was an awkward pause. The Duke simply gave her a stiff, formal nod and turned to sign the register. There was no kiss. There was no celebration. Ilara was now the Duchess of Blackwood, and nothing had changed. She lived in the East Wing, he lived in the North. They were two solitary planets, orbiting a sun that had long since gone out. They met only at dinner, a torturous affair, conducted in a dining hall so vast, their small table for two seemed like a raft in a dark, empty sea. The Duke would inquire politely after her day. She would give a brief, equally polite response. He would speak of estate matters, of tenant farms and timber yields, his voice betraying no more passion for his land than he did for his new wife. Then they would eat, in a silence broken only by the clinking of silver on porcelain. Two strangers bound by a contract, sharing a meal. After a precisely allotted hour, he would incline his head. "Your Grace," he would murmur, and retreat to his study or his wing, leaving her alone once more. Ilara's days were formless and empty. Mrs. Gable ran the house with an iron-fisted efficiency that left no room for a new duchess to interfere. The staff were specters, silent and watchful, trained to a point of invisibility. Ilara felt like a ghost haunting her own home. She would wander the long, echoing corridors, her hand trailing along the cold, dusty tapestries, feeling the weight of the house's history, its profound and unshakable sadness. It was during these wanderings that she began to piece together the true nature of the tragedy that had shattered this place. She learned it not from words, but from absences. There was an entire wing of the manor, the south wing, that was kept locked. The furniture within was draped in white shrouds, visible through the keyhole, a ghostly landscape of forgotten life. The star spoke. Her governess, a sour-faced woman named Miss Finch, kept her on a tight leash, shuttling her between the nursery and the schoolroom, away from the main parts of the house, away from her father. The Duke, for his part, seemed to keep his distance from his own child. Elara would sometimes see him pause outside the nursery door, his hand raised as if to knock, only to let it fall and walk away. The pain in that simple, aborted gesture was so acute it made Elara's chest ache. He loved his daughter, she could see that, but he was terrified of her. Or perhaps terrified of the grief she represented. Elara's heart went out to the lonely, silent child. She saw in Rosalie a mirror of her own isolation, her own voicelessness in this great, cold house. The carefully constructed walls of her own polite detachment began to crack. She could endure her own lonely existence, but she could not stand by and watch a child wither away from neglect, no matter how well-intentioned. She decided to take the initiative. It was a risk. She was overstepping the cold, clear boundaries the Duke had established. But the sight of Rosalie's small, sad face in the window was a call to action she could not ignore. Her first attempt was a disaster. She went to the nursery, her heart beating a nervous rhythm against her ribs. Miss Finch opened the door a crack, her face a mask of disapproval. "Yes, Your Grace?" the governess asked, her tone making it clear that Elara was an unwelcome interruption. "I came to see Rosalie," Elara said, trying to keep her voice gentle and unthreatening. "I thought perhaps we could read a story together." "Lady Rosalie is in the middle of her lessons," Miss Finch said stiffly. "She must not be disturbed." Through the crack in the door, Elara could see Rosalie sitting at a small table, her back ramrod straight, staring at a book with unseeing eyes. "Of course," Elara said, forcing a smile. "Perhaps later then." Miss Finch did not reply. She simply closed the door in Elara's face. Elara stood in the silent hallway, stung by the rejection. She would not be so easily deterred. If she could not reach Rosalie through the official channels of the nursery, she would find another way. Her thoughts turned to the ruined garden outside her window. It was a place of sorrow. Imperceptibly. "Your Grace, the Duke has given strict orders that the garden is to be left as it is." "The Duke's orders were for the gardeners," Elara countered gently. "I am not a gardener, I am his wife, and I wish to have a space of my own to tend. I require no assistance, just a pair of gloves and some simple tools." Relaxing. Mrs. Gable studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Elara held her breath, expecting a flat refusal. But then the housekeeper gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I will see that you get them, Your Grace." That afternoon, Elara went out into the tangled wilderness. The air was crisp and cold, the wind whipping strands of hair from her carefully pinned chignon. She wore a simple, sturdy dress, and the thick leather gloves Mrs. Gable had procured for her. She started with a small, manageable patch near the moss-covered fountain. The work was difficult, her hands unaccustomed to the labor. She pulled at stubborn, deep-rooted weeds, her muscles quickly beginning to ache. She untangled the thorny, choking brambles from a rose bush that still showed a flicker of life, its woody stems bearing a few hardy green leaves. She worked for hours, losing track of time, her mind focused solely on the task at hand. For the first time since her arrival, she felt a sense of purpose. She was not just enduring, she was acting. She was not a ghost in this house. She was a presence, imposing her will on this small corner of neglect. As the sun began to sink towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the lawn, she felt a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the feeling of being watched. She turned slowly, her heart giving a little jump. There, at the window of the nursery on the second floor, was Rosalie. The child was standing on a chair, her small hands pressed against the glass, her pale face a small white oval in the growing dusk. She was watching Elara. Her expression was not fearful, as it usually was. It was one of intense, silent curiosity. Elara's breath caught in her throat. She slowly, deliberately, raised her gloved hand and gave a small, hesitant wave. For a long moment, Rosalie did not move. Then, just as Ilara was about to turn away, thinking her gesture had been a mistake. The child start. The garden became Ilara's sanctuary, the organizing principle of her empty days. Every morning, after the silent ritual of breakfast with the Duke, she would change into her sturdy dress and spend hours kneeling in the damp earth. The physical labor was a balm to her restless mind, a way to channel her frustration and loneliness into something productive. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to reclaim the garden from its long neglect. She cleared the choking weeds, pruned the dead wood from the roses and wisteria, and uncovered the lost outlines of what had once been intricate flower beds. She found a rhythm in the work, a deep satisfaction in the simple, honest ache of her muscles at the end of the day. The staff, at first, watched her with a kind of stunned disbelief. The new Duchess, a lady of title and breeding, on her hands and knees in the dirt. But as the days turned into weeks, their watchfulness softened into a quiet, grudging respect. Mrs. Gable would ensure a hot bath was drawn for her without being asked. A footman would leave a tray with a pot of tea and sandwiches near the French doors, a silent offering of sustenance. And every day, Rosalie would watch. The child would appear at the nursery window like a faithful sentinel, her small, pale face pressed against the glass. She never waved again, but her presence was constant, a silent, curious observer to Ilara's slow transformation of the world below. Ilara learned to be aware of her audience. She would sometimes hold up a particularly interesting earthworm for inspection, or point out a ladybug crawling on a leaf, narrating her discoveries in a low, gentle voice, knowing the sound would not carry, but hoping the intent would. One afternoon, as Ilara was carefully transplanting a patch of resilient bluebells she had discovered hiding under a thicket of thorns, the nursery door on the far side of the lawn opened. Miss Finch emerged, holding Rosalie's hand in a tight grip, clearly intending to take her for a prescribed, brisk walk along the gravel paths. But Rosalie stopped dead, her little shoes skidding on the gravel. She pulled against the governess's hand, her gaze fixed on Ilara. "Come along, Lady Rosalie," Miss Finch said, her voice sharp and impatient. "We do not have time to dawdle." Rosalie did not move. She simply stared. Her small "I wonder if she might help me with a very important task first." She picked up the wicker basket. "These weeds are very wicked, you see. They try to strangle the flowers. They need to be taken to the compost heap at the very edge of the grounds. It is a long journey. I could use a brave helper." Rosalie's head lifted, her pale eyes wide. Miss Finch opened her mouth to object, but for the first time, Rosalie asserted herself. She pulled her hand free from the governess's grasp and took a single, hesitant step towards Ilara, and then another. Miss Finch stood, mouth agape, utterly scandalized. Ilara held her breath. Rosalie stopped a few feet away from Ilara, her hands clasped tightly behind her back. She looked from Ilara's face to the basket, then back again. Ilara's heart hammered in her chest. She knelt down, so she was at the child's level. "It's quite a heavy basket," Ilara said softly. "I don't know if I can manage it all on my own." Slowly, tentatively, Rosalie reached out a small, trembling hand and took hold of one side of the basket's handle. Her touch was feather-light. Ilara curled her fingers around the other side. Together, they lifted it. It was a clumsy, lopsided effort, but they were doing it together. A strange, fierce joy surged through Ilara. They walked in silence, side by side, their shared burden linking them. Miss Finch followed at a furious, disapproving distance. They reached the compost heap, a pile of leaves and cuttings at the far end of the kitchen garden, and solemnly tipped the weeds out. On the walk back, Rosalie's steps were lighter. As they approached the spot where Ilara had been working, the child pointed a small, hesitant finger at the newly cleared patch of earth. Ilara followed her gaze. "Yes," she said, "I think pansies would look lovely there, don't you? Little velvet faces, or perhaps daisies." Rosalie looked at her, and for the first time, the fear in her eyes was replaced by something else, a flicker of interest, a question. From that day on, their ritual changed. Rosalie's afternoon walk now included a stop in the garden. At first, she would only watch from a safe distance as Ilara worked. The faded blue. It must have belonged to Rosalie, lost long ago. Ilara cleaned it as best she could on her apron and held it out. "Look what I found, Rosalie. I believe she has been waiting for you." Rosalie stared at the doll, her face pale. She reached out a trembling hand and took it. She cradled it in her small hands, her thumb gently tracing the crack on its cheek. Her lower lip began to tremble. A single, perfect tear rolled down her cheek and splashed onto the doll's faded dress. Ilara's heart broke for her. She knelt beside the child, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's all right," she whispered. "We can mend her." Rosalie looked up at her, her gray eyes swimming with tears, and then, in a voice no louder than the rustle of a leaf, a voice rough with disuse, she spoke. "Mama," she whispered. The single word hung in the air between them, fragile and momentous. It was the first word Ilara had ever heard her speak. It was a word of grief, of memory, of a loss so profound it had stolen her voice for 2 years. Ilara felt her own eyes fill with tears. She didn't correct the child, didn't say, "I am not your mother." In that moment it didn't matter. She simply gathered the small, trembling girl into her arms and held her close. Rosalie buried her face in Ilara's shoulder, clutching the broken doll, and for the first time in a very long time she cried, not silently, but with great, gulping sobs of pent-up sorrow. Ilara held her, rocking her gently, murmuring soft, soothing nonsense, her own tears dampening the child's dark hair. She was so absorbed in comforting the weeping child that she did not hear the footsteps on the gravel path behind her. "What is the meaning of this?" The voice was low and harsh, laced with a cold fury. Ilara froze, her arms tightening around Rosalie. She looked up. The Duke stood not 10 feet away, a thunderous expression on his face. He had clearly just returned from a ride. His boots were splattered with mud, and he held his riding crop in a white-knuckled grip. His pale eyes were fixed on the sight of his new wife holding his weeping daughter, and his face was a mask of anguish and rage. "She is upset," Ilara said, her voice trembling slightly. "We found her doll." Rosalie, hearing her father's voice, stiffened a dirt-smudged cheek, her simple, worn dress, and the genuine, unfeigned compassion in her eyes as she held his child. He saw the cleared patch of garden behind her, the evidence of weeks of patient, tireless work. He saw the broken doll in Rosalie's hand. And then he heard it. Rosalie, her face still hidden, whispered the word again, a tiny, muffled plea. "Mama." The Duke flinched, as if he had been struck. The riding crop fell from his nerveless fingers, landing with a soft thud on the grass. The icy mask he wore at all times shattered, and for a fleeting, unguarded moment, Ilara saw the man beneath. A man drowning in a grief so vast it was breathtaking. His pale eyes, fixed on Ilara and the child she held, were filled with a chaotic, unreadable storm of emotions. There was pain, there was fury, but there was also something else, something new and terrifying to him. A glimmer of unwilling gratitude, a flicker of grudging respect. He stared at them for a long, silent moment, the tableau of the woman he had married out of cold necessity, comforting the daughter he could not bring himself to touch. The carefully constructed walls of his world were being breached, not by force, but by a quiet, persistent tenderness he did not understand and had not prepared for. Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode back towards the house, his posture rigid, his retreat swift and absolute. He was fleeing from the sight of his daughter's tears, from the sound of that whispered word, and from the unexpected, unsettling warmth that this strange woman had brought into the frozen landscape of his life. Ilara watched him go, her heart pounding. She had trespassed, not just into his garden, but into the locked fortress of his grief. She did not know if he would punish her for it or thank her, but as she held his small, silent daughter, who was slowly, tentatively, beginning to relax in her arms again, she knew she did not regret it. She had made a connection in this house of ghosts, and for the first time, Blackwood Manor felt a little less like a prison. The Duke's retreat was absolute. For 2 days following the scene in the garden, He made himself scarce. A jolt of dread. It was from her cousin, Isabel. "Dearest Elora," it began, the salutation dripping with false affection. "Alistair and I were married last week, in a small private ceremony. We are on our way to visit friends in the north, and find ourselves passing so very close to your new home. We would be delighted to call upon you and your Duke tomorrow afternoon to offer our felicitations in person. I am so very eager to see you settled in your grand new life." The letter was a declaration of war, disguised as a social call. Isabel, now Viscountess Finch, was coming to inspect her handiwork, to gloat over Elara's strange, cold marriage, and to flaunt her own victory. The thought of seeing her, of seeing Alistair again, filled Elara with a cold, sick dread. She had no desire to parade her bizarre, in-name-only marriage before their malicious eyes. She knew she could not refuse the visit without causing a scandal. To turn away a viscount and his new wife, her own cousin no less, would be an unpardonable social slight. She was trapped. That evening, at dinner, the Duke finally reappeared. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than before. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words. Elara knew she had to tell him. "Your Grace," she began, her voice quiet but steady, "I received a letter today." He looked up from his plate, his expression guarded. "Indeed, it was from my cousin, Isabel. She and Viscount Finch were recently married. They are passing nearby, and wish to call upon us tomorrow afternoon." The Duke's fork stilled, his pale eyes narrowed, and she saw a flicker of the cold fury she had seen in the garden. He, of all people, knew the context of that name. He had been there, a witness to her public humiliation. "You do not wish to see them," he stated. It was not a question. "No," Elara admitted, relief washing over her that he understood. "I do not." "Then they shall not be received. I will have a footman send a note of regret. The Duchess is indisposed." It was a simple, dismissive solution. A command from a duke was unarguable. Elara hesitated. While the thought of turning them away was deeply tempting, she knew Isabel, a simple who is secure in her position. "I would have them see that their betrayal did not break me, but instead elevated me." It was a performance, a lie. But it was a lie she desperately needed to be believed, just for one afternoon. "I cannot do that alone," she finished softly. I need your help." She was asking him to do more than simply be present. She was asking him to play the part of a husband, to form an alliance with her, however temporary, against a common enemy. It was a monumental request, a direct challenge to the cold terms he had so clearly laid out. He was silent for a long time, his expression unreadable. Elara's heart pounded, certain he would refuse. He had no reason to help her, no obligation to partake in her social battles. Then, to her utter astonishment, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Very well, Your Grace. We shall receive your cousin, and we shall give her a story to tell." A strange, cold light entered his eyes, the look of a strategist planning a campaign. "Let them come. We will be ready for them." The next afternoon, Elara dressed with the care of a soldier preparing for battle. She chose a gown of deep sapphire velvet, a color that was regal and severe, a reflection of her new station. She wore her hair in a simple, elegant chignon, adorned only with a string of pearls the Duke's solicitor had delivered along with the marriage contracts. The Beaumont pearls. They were cool and heavy against her skin, a tangible symbol of the power and history she now represented. She found the Duke waiting for her in the grand salon, a room she had never seen used before. A fire blazed in the hearth, casting a warm, welcoming glow over the rich furnishings. He stood by the window, dressed not in his usual stark black, but in a tailored coat of deep charcoal grey that softened his harsh angles. He looked impossibly distinguished, the very picture of a powerful, confident aristocrat. He turned as she entered, and his eyes swept over her. For a moment, his neutral expression shifted, and she saw a flicker of genuine appreciation in his gaze. "Your Grace," he said, his voice a low murmur, "you look formidable." "That was the intention," she replied. A small room, and Ilara had to steel herself. Alistair looked uncomfortable, his usual easy charm replaced by a shifty, nervous energy. He could not quite meet Ilara's eyes. Isabel, however, was radiant with malice. She swept into the room in a gown of garish yellow, her eyes darting everywhere, taking in the grandeur of the salon, her expression a mixture of envy and predatory glee. "Ilara, darling!" she trilled, moving to embrace her. Ilara stood still, allowing the brief, perfumed contact before stepping back. "And your grace," Isabel said, turning to the Duke and executing a low, flourishing curtsy. "How good of you to receive us! We were so thrilled to hear of your and Ilara's wonderful news." "Viscountess," the Duke said, his voice cool and smooth as polished steel. He did not smile. "Welcome to Blackwood." The ensuing conversation was a masterclass in veiled insults and social maneuvering. Isabel did her best to needle Ilara, commenting on the bleakness of the landscape, the somberness of the house, all while pretending to offer compliments. "It's all so grand, Ilara," she said, her eyes sweeping the room. "So very different from what you're used to. It must be a challenge, running a place of this scale. But then, you were always so very practical." The implication was clear. You are a poor relation, a country mouse, unsuited for this palace. Before Ilara could respond, the Duke answered for her. "The Duchess is a natural," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. His hand on her back exerted a gentle, reassuring pressure. "Blackwood has not felt so alive in years. She has a talent for bringing life to things." His eyes met Ilara's over Isabel's head, and there was a silent, shared understanding in his gaze. He was referring to the garden. He was defending her. Isabel's smile faltered. She turned her attack to the Duke. "We were all so surprised by the suddenness of your engagement," she purred. "It was terribly romantic. A whirlwind. Alistair and I were just saying, it's a shame you two must have had so little time to get to know one another." It was a pointed jab at the true her. She immediately started walking towards Ilara, ignoring the strangers completely. "Rosalie," the Duke said, his voice sharp with surprise. The child froze, her gaze darting to her father. Fear flickered in her eyes. Isabel saw her opportunity. "Oh, what a precious child," she exclaimed, in a sickly sweet voice, moving towards Rosalie. "Is this your daughter, Your Grace? She is very quiet." She crouched down, her yellow dress pooling on the floor. "Hello, little one. I am your new mamma's cousin." Rosalie shrank back, pressing herself against a large armchair, her knuckles white where she clutched the doll. "She is shy with strangers," Ilara said quickly, moving to intervene. But the Duke was faster. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and placed himself between Isabel and his daughter. It was a gesture of pure, instinctual protection. "My daughter is not part of your afternoon's entertainment, Viscountess," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low temperature. He then knelt down, turning his back on his guests, and faced his daughter. "Rosalie," he said, his voice now gentle, stripped of its usual harshness. "It is all right. You are safe." Rosalie looked from her father's face to Ilara, who had come to stand beside him. She saw them together, a united front. Hesitantly, she stepped out from behind the chair and walked directly to Ilara, pressing herself against her legs and holding up the doll. "Broken," Rosalie whispered, her voice barely audible, but clear in the silent room. Isabel's jaw dropped. The child had spoken. Ilara smiled down at her. "I know, sweet girl, but we can fix her. We will fix her together." She stroked Rosalie's hair, her heart swelling with love for this fragile, brave little girl. She looked up and met the Duke's eyes. He was watching her, not with the coldness of a stranger, but with an expression of raw, unguarded vulnerability. He saw the easy tenderness between his wife and his daughter, a connection he had been unable to forge himself. He saw Ilara, not as a contract or a convenience, but as a woman of profound strength and compassion. But it was the most powerful thing he had ever said to her. As Alistair and a furious Isabel were shown out, leaving the three of them alone in the firelit salon, Ilara knew that something fundamental had shifted between them. The shared challenge had been met, and in the process, their cold, empty truce had been forged into a fragile, unexpected alliance. The departure of the Viscount and Viscountess left a profound silence in its wake. The air in the salon, which had been thick with tension and unspoken animosity, now felt strangely still and empty. Rosalie, sensing the threat had passed, relaxed her grip on Ilara's dress, her small body losing its rigid posture. The Duke stood by the fireplace, one hand resting on the marble mantelpiece, staring into the flames. He looked, Ilara thought, like a man who had just survived a battle, only to find himself on the edge of a far more perilous one. Ilara knelt and gently disentangled herself from Rosalie. "Why don't you and I take your doll to the kitchen?" she said softly to the child. "I think Cook may have some strong glue that will be just the thing to mend her arm." Rosalie nodded, her large grey eyes, so like her father's, fixed on Ilara with absolute trust. She placed her small hand in Ilara's, and together they left the salon, leaving the Duke alone with his thoughts. The task of mending the doll became a quiet, intricate ceremony in a warm corner of the vast kitchens. Cook, a round, rosy-cheeked woman who had always treated Ilara with a reserved kindness, produced a pot of fish glue and watched with a soft smile as Ilara carefully, painstakingly, reattached the doll's broken arm. Rosalie sat beside her, utterly absorbed, her breathing soft and even. When the doll was whole again, wrapped in a strip of linen to hold the arm in place while it dried, Rosalie let out a small, contented sigh. She looked up at Ilara, and her face broke into a slow, radiant smile. It was the first time Ilara had ever seen her truly smile, and the sight was so beautiful it made her heart ache. Later, after she had tucked a sleeping Rosalie, clutching her mended doll, into her bed, Ilara found herself too restless to retreat to her own wing. The events of the afternoon, resonant voice from within. She opened the door and stepped inside. The room was magnificent, lined from floor to ceiling with thousands of leather-bound books. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and beeswax. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the Duke sat in a large wing-back chair beside it, a half-empty glass of brandy on the table beside him. He was not reading. He was simply staring into the fire, his profile etched in shadow and flickering light. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Your Grace," he said, his voice quiet. "I hope I am not disturbing you," she said, remaining by the door. "You are not," he replied. He gestured to the chair opposite his. "Please." She crossed the room, the thick Persian carpet muffling her footsteps, and sat. The silence between them was different now. It was not the empty, awkward silence of their dinners, but a heavy, waiting silence, filled with things that needed to be said. "Thank you," she said at last, breaking it. "For today." He turned his head to look at her, his pale eyes catching the firelight. "There is no need for thanks. They insulted my wife, and they threatened my daughter. I would have done the same for any duchess." The words were a partial retreat, an attempt to re-establish the formal distance between them. But the effect was ruined by the memory of his actions, of the raw emotion she had seen in his eyes. "Perhaps," she allowed, "but you did not have to play the part so convincingly." A ghost of a smile, so faint it was barely there, touched his lips. "Isabel is a formidable opponent. She required a convincing performance." He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "You were magnificent. You did not flinch." "I have had a great deal of practice in not flinching," she said quietly. The quiet admission hung in the air between them. He looked at her, truly looked at her, his gaze holding a new depth of understanding. He saw not just the resilient duchess, but the woman who had stood alone in a ballroom, her world collapsing around her, and had found the strength to walk away with her head held high. Rosalie spoke, he said, his voice dropping, becoming rough with an emotion memory. He finally turned from the fire, and his eyes, when they met hers, were filled with a torment so profound it stole her breath. The carefully constructed fortress of his composure was crumbling, and the grief he had held at bay for so long was threatening to overwhelm him. "You do not understand," he said, his voice hoarse. "You think me a cold man, a cruel father, who keeps his distance from his own child. And I am. But it is not because I do not love her. It is because I cannot bear to look at her." He stood up and began to pace before the fire, his tall frame casting a long, restless shadow. "She has her mother's eyes, the same pale grey. Every time I look at her, I see Liana, and I see what I did." "What you did?" Elara whispered, confused. "It was an accident, a fall from a horse. That is what everyone says." He let out a harsh, bitter laugh that held no humor. "An accident, yes. That is the story we told the world. The story I have been telling myself." He stopped his pacing and faced her, his face a mask of self-loathing. "It was not an accident, Elara. It was my fault. Liana is dead because of me." The confession fell into the silent room with the weight of a tombstone. Elara stared at him, her mind reeling. This was the secret at the heart of Blackwood. This was the source of the poison that had infected the house, the family, the man himself. Liana. She was full of life, he began, his voice thick with unshed tears. So much life. More than this house could contain. She loved to ride, fast and reckless. I was always telling her to be careful. I was afraid for her. That day, we had argued. A stupid argument. I don't even remember what it was about, but I was angry. She wanted to go riding. I told her the horse she favored, a spirited stallion, was too fresh, too dangerous. I forbade her from riding him. He paused, swallowing hard, his gaze lost in the terrible memory. She laughed at me. She called me a warrior, a tyrant. She said she would ride with her. If I hadn't tried to control her, she would have taken the stallion. He would not have faltered. She would have been safe. She took the old mare to spite me. Her death was an act of defiance aimed at me. I drove her to it. I killed her. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Elara's heart shattered for him, for the proud, cold duke, now broken before her, confessing the guilt he had carried like a shroud for 2 years. He had locked himself away, locked his daughter away, locked his heart away, all because he believed he was a monster. And Rosalie, he choked out the name. Rosalie saw it. She was playing in the meadow. She saw her mother fall. She saw me run to her. She saw the blood. She has not spoken since that day. Every time I look at her, I am reminded of what I did to her. I took her mother, and I stole her voice. How can I possibly be a father to her? I am poison. He finally collapsed back into his chair, his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. The formidable Duke of Blackwood, the man who had terrified the London ton with his coldness, was weeping like a lost child. Elara's own tears were streaming down her face. All the pieces fell into place. The locked south wing, the neglected garden, his fear of his own daughter, the profound, suffocating sadness of the house. It was all born from this one terrible moment, and the crushing guilt he had borne alone ever since. She did not know what to do, what to say. There were no words that could heal a wound so deep. So she did the only thing she could. She rose from her chair and went to him. She did not touch him. She simply knelt on the rug beside his chair, a silent presence in the face of his overwhelming grief. She would not leave him to face it alone. Not anymore. She stayed there, kneeling by his side as the fire burned low, offering the quiet, unwavering support of her presence. She was no longer just the Duchess of Blackwood, a party to a contract. She was a witness to his soul. And in the shared darkness of the library, amidst the ruins of his past, a new, fragile, and terrifying intimacy was woman before him. He had married her for her resilience, her quiet dignity, her suitability as a duchess. He had never expected this deep well of empathy, this quiet strength that did not flinch from his ugliness, but met it with grace. A log in the fireplace shifted and collapsed, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The spell was broken. He straightened in his chair, a flicker of his old, guarded self returning to his eyes as he attempted to rebuild his shattered composure. "It is late," he said, his voice still strained. "You should get some rest." It was a dismissal, a retreat to the familiar safety of their separate lives. But Ilara did not move. "Alaric," she said, using his given name for the first time. The sound of it, spoken so softly in the quiet room, was a shock, an act of profound intimacy. He flinched, his head snapping up to look at her. "It was not your fault," she said, her voice firm and clear. "A tragedy is not a failure of character. It is a terrible, random cruelty of life. You argued. Husbands and wives argue. It is a part of love, a part of a shared life. Liana made a choice. A reckless one, perhaps, born of anger, but it was her choice. You cannot carry the weight of her decisions." He shook his head, a gesture of denial, but the conviction in it was gone. "You did not know her. She was a force of nature. I should have known better than to try and cage her." "You did not try to cage her," Ilara insisted gently. "You tried to protect her. You loved her. That is not a crime. The crime is what you have done to yourself since, the prison you have built for yourself, and for Rosalie." Her words struck a chord, a truth he had perhaps known deep down, but had refused to acknowledge. He looked away from her, towards the dark windows, where the first pale hint of dawn was beginning to grey the sky. "What am I to do?" he asked, the question a whisper of pure despair. "I do not know how to be anything else." "You can start by forgiving yourself," Ilara said, "and you can start by letting your daughter have her father back." She finally reached out, her hand hesitating for a moment before she placed it gently on his arm. His muscles were rigid beneath the fine wool of her cheek. His touch was hesitant, almost reverent, a stark contrast to the cold, impersonal hand he had offered her in the carriage. It was the touch of a man relearning a long-forgotten language. "Ilara," he breathed her name. And this time it was not a title or a designation, but a discovery. In his eyes, she saw the ruins of his grief, but she also saw the first, fragile green shoots of something new, hope, gratitude, and something more, something that made her heart beat faster. He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips. The air grew thick, charged with a current of electricity that had been building since the moment he had placed his hand on her back in the salon. This was the turning point. This was the moment where the contract could be broken or transformed into something else entirely. Her mind screamed at her to be cautious, to remember the terms he had set, the walls he had built. But her heart, which had felt nothing but duty and pain for so long, urged her forward into this unknown, terrifying, and beautiful territory. She did not pull away. She met his gaze, her own eyes conveying all the unspoken compassion and burgeoning affection she felt for this broken, beautiful man. He closed the small distance between them, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not one of passion or of demand. It was a kiss of profound tenderness, of gratitude, of shared sorrow, and tentative hope. It was hesitant at first, a question, and when she responded, her lips softening against his, it deepened into something more. It was a promise of healing, a quiet acknowledgement that from the ashes of their separate griefs, something new and whole could be built. It was a kiss that tasted of brandy and tears and the faintest hint of wood smoke. It was the first true kiss of Ilara's life, and it held more meaning, more honest emotion than 1,000 pretty words from a man like Alistair ever could. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. I am lost, Ilara, he whispered. Then we will find our way together, she answered, her voice steady and sure. For the first time since she had arrived at Blackwood Manor, she was not just enduring, she was home. The turning point had been reached, stroking the back of her hand. Sleep, Ilara, he had said, his voice low and gentle. We will talk more in the morning. He had not tried to kiss her again, and she was grateful for the space, for the chance to let the monumental shift in their relationship settle. She hadn't been able to sleep. She had sat by her window, watching the sky lighten, her mind replaying every moment from the library. His confession, his tears, the breathtaking vulnerability in his eyes, the tender, transformative pressure of his lips on hers. The Duke of Blackwood, the man of ice and iron, was gone. In his place was Alaric, a man of deep feeling and profound grief, a man who had trusted her with the broken pieces of his soul. And she, Ilara, the Duchess of Convenience, found herself falling in love with him. The realization was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. She dressed with care that morning, choosing a simple gown of soft dove grey that felt appropriate for the new, quieter intimacy between them. When she descended for breakfast, she found him already there, but he was not seated at the far end of the long, imposing table. He was standing by the windows of the breakfast room, a smaller, sunnier space she had never seen him use, looking out at her garden. He turned as she entered, and a slow, hesitant smile touched his lips. It transformed his face, erasing years of sorrow and severity. "Good morning," he said, and the simple greeting was filled with a warmth that made her heart flutter. "Good morning, Alaric," she replied, her own smile feeling natural and unforced for the first time in his presence. A servant entered to serve them, but Alaric waved him away. "We will serve ourselves," he said. He poured her a cup of tea and handed it to her, their fingers brushing. The small, domestic act was more intimate than any of the formal dinners they had shared. They ate in a comfortable silence, the morning sun streaming into the room, the oppressive weight that had always hung between them gone, replaced by a sense of peaceful anticipation. After they had finished, he stood and came around the table to her. He held out his hand. "Will you walk with me?" She placed her hand in his without hesitation. "Wrong. Forgetting is not healing. You taught me that." He pushed the door open. A wave of stale cold air washed over them. The corridor beyond was dark, the windows covered by heavy drapes. But Alaric did not hesitate. He led her into the darkness, his hand a warm, steady anchor in hers. He walked to the nearest window and, with a single decisive movement, pulled back the heavy velvet curtains. Sunlight flooded the space, illuminating a thick layer of dust that coated every surface. The furniture was draped in white shrouds, giving the room the appearance of a ghostly, abandoned ballroom. "This was our sitting room," he said softly. He walked to a shrouded form and pulled off the sheet, revealing an elegant chaise lounge, upholstered in faded rose silk. "Liana would lie here for hours, reading French novels I thought were frivolous." There was no pain in his voice now, only a gentle, wistful fondness. He led her through the wing, room by room, pulling back the curtains, unveiling the furniture, and sharing a memory in each space. He showed her the music room, where a grand piano stood silent, and told her how Liana would play energetic polkas, instead of the somber sonatas he preferred. He led her into a beautiful light-filled studio, an easel still standing in the center, a half-finished painting of the Moors draped in a cloth. She was a gifted artist, he said. She saw color everywhere, even on the greyest days. He was not just opening the rooms, he was opening his past to her, sharing the ghost that had haunted him, not as a specter of guilt, but as a memory of love. He was allowing Liana to be a person again, not just a tragedy. Finally, they stood before the door to what had been their bedchamber. He paused, his hand on the knob. "This is the hardest part," he admitted, his voice tight. He opened the door. The room was just as they had left it 2 years ago. A shawl was draped over a chair. A book lay open on the bedside table. It was a perfectly preserved moment in time. He did not speak. He simply stood there, letting the memories wash over him. Ilara watched him, her heart full. She knew what this cost him, and what a gift it was. He was trusting her to stand with him in the most sacred, painful place in his home. After a long silence, he turned to breath, his gaze searching hers, laying his soul bare. I know I have no right to ask it. I know the man you agreed to marry was a cold, empty shell. But that man is gone, and the man who stands before you now, he is, to his own profound astonishment, falling in love with you. Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, tears of joy and overwhelming relief. The words she had never dared to hope for, the future she had thought impossible, were being offered to her freely, openly, with all the passion and sincerity she had ever dreamed of. Alaric, she whispered, her voice choked with her own tears, you are not the only one who has been astonished. She squeezed his hands, her gaze locked with his. I think I started falling in love with you the day I saw you in the garden, looking at your daughter with such pain and love in your eyes. I love the man who paces in his library, and the man who defends his family, and the man who is brave enough to open a locked door. A slow, brilliant smile spread across his face, a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. He let out a shaky laugh, a sound of profound release. Then I am the most fortunate of men, he said, to be saved from myself by a woman of such grace and strength. He framed her face with his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. Marry me, Ilara Vance, he whispered. Marry me for real this time. Be my wife, my partner, my love. Share my life, my home, my heart. Yes, she breathed, the single word encompassing all of her hopes, all of her love. Oh, yes, Alaric. Always, yes. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not the tentative, questioning kiss of the night before. It was a kiss of certainty, of declaration, of a future joyfully embraced. It was a promise made, not in a cold, sterile chapel, but here, in the heart of his past. A promise to build a new life together. As he held her, the sunlight streaming through the window of the once-forgotten room, Ilara knew that the shadows had, finally, truly, been banished from Blackwood Manor. The house was no longer a place of ghosts, but a home waiting to be filled with life and laughter and a love that had been born from the deepest winter and had blossomed, against all odds, into a glorious, unexpected spring. Long table had been set up on the lawn, laden with cakes and lemonade, to celebrate Rosalie's 8th birthday. Rosalie herself, no longer a silent, fearful ghost, was a whirlwind of energy and joy. Dressed in a bright blue dress, her dark hair flying behind her, she ran across the lawn, her laughter echoing in the warm afternoon air. She was playing a game of hide-and-seek with a group of children from the village and the tenant farms, her shyness replaced by a confident, happy exuberance. Ilara sat on a bench beneath the shade of a newly flourishing wisteria, watching the scene with a heart so full she thought it might burst. She was expecting their first child in the autumn, and her hand rested protectively on the gentle swell of her stomach. The past year had been one of quiet, joyful discovery. Together, she and Alaric had navigated the delicate process of becoming a family. They had talked for hours, sharing stories, hopes, and fears. They had filled the once silent halls of the manor with conversation and laughter. The south wing had been aired out and redecorated, its sad history honored, but no longer allowed to dominate the present. Alaric came to sit beside her, handing her a glass of cool lemonade. He followed her gaze to where Rosalie was now peeking out from behind a large rosebush, her face alight with mischief. I still cannot believe that is the same child, he said, his voice filled with a quiet awe. She was always in there, Ilara replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. She just needed the sun. He slipped his arm around her, his hand coming to rest over hers on their unborn child. We all did, he said softly. You were the sun, Ilara. You came into our winter, and you saved us. We saved each other, she corrected, turning to look at him. The love she felt for him was a steady, warm flame, a source of constant light in her life. The harsh lines of his face had softened over the past year, the perpetual grief in his eyes replaced by a gentle contentment. He was still a man of immense strength and presence, but his power was now tempered with a warmth and tenderness she had once thought impossible. He smiled, that slow, wonderful smile that was still reserved after the guests had departed. The three of them walked through the garden as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold. Rosalie walked between them, holding both of their hands. "Papa," she said, looking up at Alaric, "for my next birthday, can I have a pony?" Alaric stopped and looked at Ilara, a flicker of the old fear in his eyes. A pony. A horse. The echo of the past was still there. Ilara gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. She knelt down in front of Rosalie. "A pony is a very big responsibility, sweet girl," she said gently. "You have to be very careful and very patient when you learn to ride." "I will be," Rosalie promised, her grey eyes wide and serious. "You can teach me, Papa. You're the best rider in the whole world." Alaric looked at his daughter, at her trusting, upturned face, and the last of the shadows in his heart seemed to dissipate. He knelt beside Ilara, so they were both at Rosalie's level. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I can teach you. We will learn together." He reached out, his hand covering Ilara's, and the three of them were joined, a circle of love and healing in the heart of the garden that had brought them all back to life. The house stood behind them, its windows glowing with warm light. No longer a fortress of grief, but a home, a true home. Ilara looked from her husband's beloved face to her cherished daughter's, her hand resting on the promise of the new life to come. And she knew a profound and simple truth. The glittering, socially approved life she had once thought she wanted was nothing but a hollow sham compared to this. The betrayal that had shattered her world had, in fact, set her free. It had led her down a dark and terrifying path, but it had led her here, to this moment, to this love, to this beautiful, imperfect, and magnificent life, and she would not have traded it for anything. Dear listener, how often do we mistake a closed door for a final destination? Ilara believed her life was over when her carefully constructed future was shattered by betrayal. She stood in the wreckage of her reputation, facing a future she thought was one of ruin. But what felt like an ended. That healing does not come from forgetting the past, but from learning to live with it. She showed him that vulnerability is not a weakness, but the bravest form of strength. Her love didn't erase his scars. It helped him see that they were a part of a story that could still have a beautiful ending. Perhaps you too have faced a moment where your world collapsed. Perhaps you have been betrayed by those you trusted, or are haunted by a past you feel you cannot escape. Ilara's journey from a cold, loveless arrangement to a deep and abiding partnership teaches us a powerful lesson. True strength is not the absence of pain, but the courage to keep your heart open even when it is breaking. It is the resilience to find purpose in the wreckage and to offer compassion when you feel you have none left to give. It is the quiet, daily work of tending to the neglected gardens, both outside us and within. Never underestimate the power of a single, gentle act to break through the coldest ice, or the capacity of your own heart to find its way from a devastating winter into a glorious, unexpected spring. Your greatest heartbreak may just be the key that unlocks the door to your truest life. Thank you for listening. If this story touched your heart, please consider liking, sharing it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribing for more tales of love and redemption. Your support allows us to continue bringing these stories to life. We look forward to sharing another journey with you soon.